Hello and welcome to the Clockwork Game Design Podcast. I'm your host, Keith Burgun. Going to be another big episode with a lot of new content and a lot of new cool stuff. I got a lot of feedback on the last episode and it was really positive. So I'm going to be taking that feedback and working it into a new episode. This show is going to have a variety of different things. I have a couple of little mini monologues about game design, some stuff about my experience with game design, specifically with paper prototyping. I'm going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking about decisions, interesting decisions. That's going to be the first thing that we get into. Longtime fans of my stuff might remember Evizaer from my old podcast. I'm going to have him on and we're going to talk a little bit about XCom. He's written a couple of articles about it, and so we're going to have a good conversation about that. And it actually went really well, so I'm excited to show that to you. Before I get into the actual content, I just want to quickly say the Patreon has been going a lot better. I've changed the tiers up a little bit, responded to some feedback from some of my patrons. And so, yeah, this is a really good time to get on there. Now at the $10 level, you can get all my games, and I've changed other rewards around now. So you do get Discord, a special Discord role for being a patron. You get all my games at the $10 level now, not to mention all kinds of behind the scenes stuff. Like every time I'm working on things and I have some early glimpse of something, I tend to post it just for my patrons only. And I don't do that, in 3 days it unlocks thing. It's just exclusive for my patrons, and it's pretty much, they're the only ones who are probably ever going to see this stuff. So, try to become, you can get that kind of stuff at, just $1. So, do think about that. If you like the show and you like the work that I do, it really helps a lot. Thank you so much. So anyway, without any further stuff up front, let's get right into my conversation with myself about interesting decisions and this idea of decisions in games. So for a long time, strategy games in particular have been described as a series of interesting decisions. The phrase decisions, interesting decisions, has been kind of like one of the most common things that you would hear in a discussion on strategy game design. It is often attributed to Sid Meier, the original designer of the original Civilization video game. And he also actually gave a talk in 2012 wherein he talked at length about, at GDC, I believe, where he talked a lot about interesting decisions and what makes decisions interesting and all that kind of stuff. I myself had also been a subscriber to this sort of use of language. But now in the last couple of years, I've started to kind of shy away from it a little bit for a couple of reasons, which we're going to get into. But yeah, my big take here is there's dangers in using the phrase decisions with regards to strategy games. But first, let's get into a couple of these Sid Meier quotes real quick from his 2012 GDC talk. Once a game implements interesting decisions, what makes them more interesting? A strong balance of risk-reward choices, adjusting how impactful choices are, giving the player more or less information, providing time frame within which to make decisions, or adjusting how many choices there are in the game can all completely define and refine a design. The last way to make a game more interesting through decisions, get rid of ones that are not working. You've tried all these things and they don't work. Maybe the decision is just one that you could take out of your game, says Meier. This is also, I took some of this from a Game of Sutra article that was summarizing what he had said at GDC. And, none of this stuff is really surprising or, different from the norm. It's been kind of like what everyone has said about strategy game design. And this kind of language of adjust how impactful choices are, giving the player more or less information. It's like, you're just telling us what all the knobs are. You're not telling us what to do, what to value. So that's been a long time standing critique of mine about game design theory in general for a long time. But what is newer here is this idea that, decisions, if you think about the way that Sid Meier talks about it as a game as being a series of interesting decisions. And I really think that he's right, that is how we tend to make games. But I also think that that's a problem. because we shouldn't actually want a series of interesting decisions. And actually, I think a lot of what we end up doing, a lot of our games are tactical games. And I've talked about this before, that we think of ourselves as making strategy games, but what we really are making are tactics games that just go on a really long time. And there's a difference there. The example that I like to give is a critique of my own work in Oro, especially when you start getting better at the game. One of the things that it does is it scales up as you get better in the single player ELO. It scales up the amount of points that you need in order to win. So like in the early matches, when you're in like bronze rank, you might only need 30, 40 points to win. And then by, master rank or whatever, you need like 100 points, 115 points, stuff like that. It starts getting really high in number. And the thing is that the arcs of the game, the maximum sized arcs of the game, stuff like cooldowns on your ultimate, or, where you are on the mission, like on the actual map, or how many monsters are around you, things like that. The size of those is pretty fixed. And, if I were redesigning Oro, and hey, I am for Alakaram, if anyone is interested, there's been some development on Alakaram. There should be an article on that coming soon. But my point is, if I were redesigning Oro as a tactics game, which it is, it would have a very controlled length. So anyway, the point is that Oro, as it stands, in the PC version, it has this problem of being just a long tactics game. You have these very small arcs and you just do them over and over and over and over and over again many times. And that I also think applies to a lot of video games. I think that applies to Civ very strongly, actually. So that's something that I want us to all sort of start moving away from in terms of if we want to build strategy games. I also would say, it's kind of a side point, but strategy games are more of, like, if you look at strategy games versus tactics games, I do think that strategy games are a sort of more pure version of that form. I would say they are kind of a better version of that form. And by that, I mean, tactics games are inherently a little bit more puzzle-ish, and they don't bring out as much what is, I think, what is great about strategy games, which is strategy games kind of incorporate all of the forms into one, and they can be a little bit toy-like, they can be a little bit puzzle-like. They obviously have a contest element. Tactics games are more like puzzles, generally speaking. And that's also my problem with calculation, and why I want to move strategy games away from calculation. As we are trying to move strategy games closer to these longer arcs, and I've written a few articles about this. I will link a couple articles in the show notes that are relevant if some of the stuff is confusing when I'm talking about long arcs and short arcs and what those mean. I do think some of those are rather colloquially understood, but I've also gotten sort of more nitty gritty with them and what I mean by those things. So maybe check out those articles if you haven't already. But the point is, as we move more towards strategy games and strategy, here's the thing. Even if my point that strategy games are sort of better than tactics games is not accepted, like if you're listening and you're like, no, that's not true, that's false, whatever, fine. Even if that's the case, it still you'd probably agree that, hey, it'd be pretty good if we could design strategy games, at all. Whereas I really think that if you look at the most strategy games that we have are still just tactics games. And this points to a larger problem of we don't really think that much about match structure, about like the match meaning a lot. We think about that a little bit more when it comes to multiplayer games because there's this competitive element to it. But in terms of single player games, we have like no respect at all for, the match end feedback, the win-loss, the structure of a match overall. We tend to really think about strategy games even as quite similar to, roguelikes, Tetris, things, endless sort of things where the form, the length of it doesn't really matter. It's not really something that people think about. How long is a Civ match? I don't know. Just like let it go, like just like let it roll, let the tape roll and see what happens, Civ is such a good example. And I'm using that because, Sid Meier is the interesting decisions guy. And Civ is such a good example of this just ever rolling loose simulator. And in fact, I think that Civ works best as just a toy, and you sort of don't even think too much about the goals. You kind of do, but like you kind of don't too. And you kind of like come up with new goals on the fly, and you do end up playing with it more like a toy. And in fact, I think a lot of these grand strategy games are at their best when they embrace being a toy. Some of the Paradox games maybe would be good examples of that. Although notably not Stellaris. Stellaris, I went into a sort of deep dive on Stellaris last month or two ago. And that is another really good example of just this ever rolling, small reward loop thing. And that's another thing that you see and that's why I think tactics and short arcs are so appealing and natural for designers, is that it's very easy to sort of like get that little dopamine wheel rolling. Where you have these little interactions, these very short-term interactions. You think about it a lot, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then you, get a little reward, a little, you did the right thing. You basically won this small little interaction. And you just get that going. That's why Civ has that just one more turn meme about it, where, people sort of are playing in a kind of addicted way. And I've noticed that myself. Civ takes hours to finish a match, even if you play on like a small match and stuff, a small map and everything. And I notice myself playing because like I'm getting all these little reward loops. Stellaris is weirdly good about that reward loop stuff and weirdly terrible about a lot of other things, including just having a form, larger arcs. So the reason I want us to move away from this decision language is twofold. One is that they are they push us into tactical ways of thinking, and that's particularly true for designers. I think that game designers are sort of being encouraged to think, oh, should I add this decision? Should I remove this decision? And so they're necessarily thinking about this small little tactical layer of the game. And I think just the framing of decisions, I'm not saying that games shouldn't have something that could be called decisions in them. And I'll talk about what my proposal for how strategy games should look would be. But I do think that the term decision is just not the best because it accentuates the tactical and the local. I also think another thing about decision that I don't like is that it accentuates thinking, which is, sitting there and really usually it's calculating. Thinking is basically calculating. I mean, yeah, you could be sort of more heuristically calculating. Or you could be just actually mapping out okay, he moves there, I move here, he moves there, I move here, that kind of stuff. But in either case, you're really just sort of churning numbers and calculating. And this has been a problem that I've talked about for a long time in strategy games, and one of the ways that you can kind of limit that is with information horizon, which something like chess doesn't have at all. So, you can sit there and kind of just if we play chess, and I think about everything for, 5 seconds, and you think about everything for 10 or 15 seconds, you're just going to be making better moves, not because you have a better understanding of the system, but because you've just done more calculation. And that's something that I've always thought was kind of a problem in strategy games. And I want to limit that. I don't want, this is a very practical concern. I've noticed especially in board games, tabletop board games, where it's socially weird to have a timer. I've noticed that it's very common that one friend always takes the longest with their turns, and they also always win. And what's being measured here is not their understanding of the system or necessarily their creativity or any of the things that we sort of love about strategy games, but just how much labor they put into thinking through all the calculations and heuristic, assessments. And that's not what we want strategy games to be. And I think that the decision, the class, we need to move away from, and this is kind of a theme with me, but we need to move away from that image of the person sitting at the chessboard and just with their head in their hand, just like thinking and thinking. Like that shouldn't happen in strategy games. So now let's get into my vision of what strategy games should look like instead of that. I think that strategy games should basically present you with the game state, and then you rather quickly just sort of react, and you just like make an input. And it shouldn't be so fast that you make input errors, but it should be like, pretty immediate. So there's a balance there. Like, I think most real-time games, for example, certainly like MOBA games and most real-time games are too fast, and they are very input error prone. Actually, MOBAs are maybe not the best example because they're better than, I don't know, like a Team Fortress, or way better than like StarCraft. StarCraft is extremely input error prone, and that is too fast, and that's not okay. I think that also an okay example is just any turn-based game with a very short timer. I think that there's other problems that timers bring in, like hard timers like that cause other issues sometimes. But I mean, I think, for example, Go, the only way to play Go, if you're going to play Go, which I don't really recommend, is to play Blitz Go, which is like 10-second timer. And in fact, I think some Go players even recommend playing rather quickly as a way to learn more quickly and to learn more heuristically and sort of devalue the tactical battles. Although, unfortunately, I mean, ultimately, it's going to come down to those tactical battles at some point. You can only sort of like play loose and strategically for so long in Go before there comes a tactical battle that you have to either win or lose. And if you just aren't good at the tactical battles, if you haven't done enough, Go puzzles and you don't sit there like calculating it through in the 10 seconds that you have, then you're going to lose the tactical battle. And if you lose a few tactical battles, that's the game. So anyway, that's my Go critique for this episode. But yeah, so I envision strategy games where you see the state and you just, what's your answer? Just answer, like, what would you do right now? And you're like, I'll do this, like maybe a brief moment where you just make sure that this is what you want to say. It's kind of like language, like, if you're talking to somebody, you don't sit there and be like, if I ask you a question, you don't sit there and like think for 30 seconds. You may like stumble, like, wander for like a few words and then like give me an answer. So that's, I think, a better way to think about design is that like, we're just presenting, we're having a conversation with the player. And what we're trying to do is like throughout this conversation, we're trying to understand their model of the system, because that's really what should be measured here is how accurate is your model of this system. I don't want to know how much time you're spending doing math crunches in your head. I want to know how accurate is your model. So, because if you have a perfectly accurate model and I give you, and I just ask you questions, you will basically give me right answers. Of course, there might be a little bit wiggle room there, and that's fine. That should be acceptable. But for the most part, you would give like correct answers. Of course, this is a hypothetical. In real strategy games, no one should have a completely accurate model of the strategy space. And, strategy games shouldn't be solvable, obviously. Now, does this mean games all have to be real time? No. I am leaning more into real time these days for a combination of reasons. One is the reason I just gave, which is that it makes what I'm talking about natural. In a real time game, we sort of understand naturally that like you don't just sit there just thinking, right? In a real time game, you act, and so what I would often advise is a slow real time, slow enough that there's not going to be a lot of input error. We don't want to measure how many times you misclick, we want as little input error as possible. We just want to know what in your mind, what is your, we want to get a snapshot of the accuracy of your model of the system. As for turn-based, I think it's a little more tricky, especially when it comes to single player turn-based. Like I feel that players are going to have a hard time accepting a timer on a turn-based single player strategy game. In my experience, that's a tough sell. So, I'm talking about game design theory, but I'm also operating in the universe and the world, and I care about actually making games. and I care about giving you guys things that can help you make games in the actual world. And so we have to like respond to the language that people are using, and operate in the conversation as it's happening. So I do think that slow real time is the most realistic probably way to achieve what I'm trying to get at, and that's why I'm tending to lean there in my designs going forward, at least for the time being. I have been thinking a lot about Nocturnom as a real-time game. I have some really interesting ideas for that. I'm a little bit intimidated by how much work it's going to be, but we'll see how things go. Yeah, and so I'd love your thoughts on this decisions framing and whether we should get away from that. What's a good term instead of decisions? I mean, strategies, plans. Some have suggested planning rather than decision making. I think that's okay. I think planning can also have similar problems, but I like at least that planning does interface. It has only one of the problems. It doesn't have the tactical problem because planning does suggest longer arcs, I think. But planning also does kind of sound calculation-y. I don't know. Like, I almost want to just say, instead of decision making, let's call it playing, right? You're engaging with the system. You're playing. And I want games, strategy games, good strategy games should have a toy-like play quality to them because they're complex and they have a lot going on. So that's kind of where I'm at with the decision stuff, but I'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts. And that pretty much wraps up this segment of the show. So next up, we have a conversation with Evizaer. Evizaer has a blog called nohidden.info, which y'all should check out. I'll link it in the show notes, of course. He has recently written 2 articles about XCom, the 2012 version and the sequel, XCom 2. And specifically, we talk a lot about design problems having to do with information and how the game deals with the problem of its information horizon, I would really call it. But yeah, it was a good conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. So yeah, I wanted to get you on the show to talk about a couple of articles that you've written for your blog. Pardon me. A couple of articles that you've written for your blog, nohidden.info, which is a great name for a blog, game design blog. And so you're a big like XCOM player, and I've played a good amount of XCOM in the past, and we've had a bunch of really good conversations about XCOM and other tactical games. And so anyway, you've wrote these 2 articles about XCOM, the XCOM 2012 and the sequel, and the ways that it deals with specifically, I guess, hidden information and like that the classic, don't discover an alien pod on your last turn problem that people have described from XCOM 2012. But yeah, so tell me about these 2 articles. Give us the run through for people who haven't read it. I will definitely link them in the show notes. But for people who have not read the articles, can you just give us a quick run through of like what the basic concepts are?
Yeah. So I'm very interested in talking about and discovering ways of like looking at how games incentivize players to do specific things or to engage in certain tactics that they might not otherwise want, or that the game designers might not necessarily want, or that might work against the what makes the game most interesting to play. And in XCOM, I found the new XCOM particularly, I found an interesting example of this because there's a widely known problem. Some people might not call it a problem, but I think it's a problem in XCOM in the tactical missions, where because the penalties for overextending your squad are so harsh, and the fog of war covers so much of the map, and it's very difficult to get an idea of where aliens are until you're actually fighting them. You end up in a situation where you slowly creep your troops forward one at a time, and after you move the first guy forward on your turn, all the other guys and girls that you're moving forward, you don't want them to reveal a single other tile that wasn't revealed by the first guy. And my articles are all about this. What causes this to happen? Why this tactic of creeping forward is so prevalent and such an obviously good thing that you would do to avoid unnecessary risk. And the articles analyze the rules that lead to this problem, which mostly has to do with the fact that hidden information about where aliens are means that you don't know what's going on at all. So every single tile you reveal could have aliens on it, and you want to make sure that they don't, because as soon as you reveal an alien, you have to start fighting them. And even though you get kind of a free, you might get as much as one free turn against them after they scamper into cover, you still have to deal with aliens that appeared, at some basically random place in the edges of what you can see.
Right.
And they could be in a really advantageous position for you, or they could be in a terrible position for you that totally ruins how all your dudes are set up. So it's just huge change in what you know about the game world as soon as you reveal aliens, and it can lead to, and if you're in a bad position, you could lose soldiers, and losing soldiers is forever in XCOM. So it's a pretty bad thing.
Yeah, and part of that's important is that XCOM 2012 introduced this idea of pods, where the previous XCOM games, and actually most squad tactics games, don't have any such system. They are just, if you see one alien, you see one alien, and that alien starts engaging with you and whatever. And I can see how there's a problem with that too, in that like you are more maybe able to coordinate all your troops, and that one alien is kind of just one alien, so you're just picking them off one at a time. And I think that's probably what they were thinking with designing the 2012 system, was like, let's make it kind of a little bit more fair, that like every time you see an alien, you see a pod that's like a little bit more of a match for your group, right?
Right. You want to break it. They want to break the combat encounters into chunks that are challenging but still beatable in sequence. Right. Because the idea is typically that you have 3 to 5 pods on a map, and pods are like 3 to 5 aliens. Sometimes you might only have one alien in a pod if it's a really powerful alien. But like, it's just a way of just having a chunk of content that you have to beat before you can move on to other stuff, and to make sure the challenge is not like puny when you, because like if you're able to just kind of draw out one alien at a time, as you see in a lot of video games that you play, even like first person shooters and stuff, you kind of want to just draw one guy out at a time and then ambush and kill him. That's a standard video game tactic that everybody does a lot if they know how to play video games. Yeah. So having an entire pod activate at a time is like really cool in a way as a design decision, because it means that you're actually dealing with more aliens and it's more dangerous. So the stakes are higher, and you have to know more about the combat system, because you can't just take one guy out and assassinate him and then wait for the next guy to walk by and assassinate him, and so on and so forth. Right. So yeah, it's a step forward in that sense for the design, but it's also a step backward, or a step sideways, or kind of backward, because that just it ends up emphasizing the penalties more than the benefits, I guess you could say. Since
I have a couple of...
having to deal with 3 aliens is like having to deal with like 3 or 4 aliens is so much more hard than dealing with one. Yeah. And it's not like the penalties for screwing up have gotten lighter with this. They're just as bad.
Well, I also think that there's 2 distinct things you can do. Like I think it makes a lot of sense to sort of clump aliens together, because I actually think it's pretty tough to make the gameplay of my 5 Marines versus 1 alien right now. I think that it's difficult to make that into an interesting challenge. So I do think it makes sense to clump up units. But the thing that's distinct about the 2012 system, and I'm just thinking through this because like with Oro, I had actually there was a phase where I was like, oh, units should always appear in like groups of like 3 or 4. That ended up like... what that can end up doing when you clumpify things is that pod number 1 and pod number 2 are almost like they're like you're on the same map, but they can sometimes almost sort of feel a little bit like separate matches. They don't interconnect to each other into a larger strategy thing sometimes. And so, yeah, I just wanted to make the distinction between clumping units up, which I think is a good idea and probably necessary, and the pod system, which alerts everyone in the pod. Like that's what makes it a pod, is that if one alien sees you, the whole pod is alerted. And I think there's other rules too. Like that's right, they all move and like randomly scatter sort of right when you see them, right?
Right, and they can also stick it so they get a free like move turn, like a turn where they can only move. they move into cover, but then also they can move away from you out of your vision too on the scamper turn, which is kind of awkward. And then in trying to reveal them, like by moving guys forward to try and engage them, you might activate other pods that are walking by a little bit further away. So things can kind of chain and get ugly because of the way they scamper and scatter. But also the fact that you always have these units, these, you know, several alien pods wandering around the map in the darkened areas. Even it severely restricts the amount of the battlefield you can use to fight the aliens. So you end up kind of not really using all the flanking and positional stuff as much as you might want to use it. Right. And also but that also means that you're not fully using the combat system in general, because you're trying to kind of hold back and not discover any more of the map than you have to in the process of fighting the aliens and killing them off.
Yeah, and I will definitely say that, like, just from a player experience perspective, like, it is absolutely the case that when I beat XCom 2012. I didn't play number 2 yet. I plan to play it. I just haven't gotten around to it. But when I played through XCom 2012, you know, it was like pretty much every single turn, every single Marine, you're hitting the Overwatch button. And I feel like that's like, when that happens, it's one of those, you know, really flashing red lights that like, something could be done better here, you know?
Yeah, you need to encourage the player to like move out and you make use of the combat area and not just kind of sit and defend. Right. Because defense is always way too strong. Like, unless you design a game specifically so defense isn't way too strong, defense is going to be way too strong in basically every kind of game like this.
Sure. Yeah, like a natural, like just having a bunch of actors sort of in a box by default, and you say no other rules, you can just move and shoot, and the last man standing alive, you know, there's an inherent advantage to being defensive there. And
it's mostly because of the fact that if your combat is mostly ranged and the range is reasonably far compared to movement distances, you have situations where like you want to draw one guy into the area where all of your guys can fire, so you can quickly focus fire and kill the one guy before he can act more than once or at all. And you know, this kind of plays out over you're always trying to create the situation where all your guys can shoot, or at least as many of your guys as necessary to kill something like in one turn, shoot at one thing at a time while nothing else can shoot at you. Like that's just the basic strategic concept of all of these games.
Yeah.
So, as a designer of a game like this, you have to put mechanics in place which prevent that from dominating and being the only thing you ever do. And some of those mechanics are like activate a whole pod at once, because then the pod can kind of move together and communicate within its. Well, it doesn't actually do it this way, but it effectively communicates within itself about where the player's units are. So it can kind of attack the player's units in a more intelligent way, which prevents the player from really ganging up on one guy, although you can still. But also, if you think about it, in XCOM, because of the way the cover is directional on the map, you have situations where you're revealing enemies that are somewhat far away, which means that the cover that they have, that they take against you, covers basically all the angles you can move guys to get to if you don't move towards them. Which also, so that encourages defense actually, but the thing is that there's like no time limit or anything, so the player almost wants to sit there and wait for the aliens to move into him, so that the player can catch the aliens while they're between cover, while the player keeps all of his dudes in cover.
Yeah,
which that's obviously a very boring dynamic. You don't want to just be sitting down in cover the entire time, and that's what you're saying with, you know, you're spamming Overwatch every turn because you're just like, all my guys are going to be in cover, and now I just want to wait for the aliens to expose themselves. That's not fun. That's not as fun as the gameplay can be. I think it's pretty boring. Some people kind of like it, but I think the game would be much better if you were forced to move out of cover yourself and try and deal with the risk and reward balancing of like, how do I move out of cover and not get shot at, or get shot at as little as possible? And how do I move from cover to cover so that I don't have my flanks exposed as much while I'm also exposing the enemy's flanks? And once you get into these kinds of trade-offs, the game really opens up and becomes a lot more dynamic.
Yeah, so we've sort of described the problem that your articles lay out and that many have experienced in playing these games. And so then you sort of tell a story about a couple of things that the developers tried in order to solve this problem or mitigate the problem. And there was two things. There's XCOM 2 has a way that I think actually works for the most part. XCOM Enemy Within, which is the expansion for the 2012 game, the original XCOM
the original XCOM remake. um, yeah, so 2012's expansion added these meld canisters to each map, which are kind of like timed reward canisters that if you run over to and pick up before they quote unquote expire, like milk going bad or something, that they give you some like resource that you can spend on beefing up your dudes between missions. And my analysis of this is that it basically doesn't succeed at all. It very minimally helps encourage the player to extend their squad a little bit more and move a little bit faster around the map. But at the same time, it feeds into a lot of the the positive and negative feedback loops that cause death spirals or trivialize the game's difficulty because of like you're just too powerful and too good at the game.
Right.
Since it's a reward that leads to your guys getting more powerful, and the way that you get it is by being a better player. You're basically rewarded for being a better player, which makes the game easier because you're beefing up your dudes.
Yeah, this is the inherent problem, the inherent rub between RPGs and strategy games, right?
Right, exactly. Because in an RPG you want systems of a long-term progression which kind of feed off of the state of the game in a dynamic way. But in a strategy game, you kind of rely on all these numbers being in certain places for all the different units and their capabilities, so that the units can actually like present some kind of a strategic challenge, and it isn't just a walkover. In like RPGs, like JRPGs, mostly the combat is supposed to be kind of an expression of your progression as a party or as a character. It's kind of be like, oh yeah, I can do damage in these numbers now, and the enemy has, even though the enemy has these defenses, I can get through them. Yeah, and it's like it's not a complex. It's seldom, I should say, because some JRPGs kind of succeed at having some strategic complexity in the combat, but usually, like if you look at Dragon Warrior games, for instance, it's like it's basically a way of comparing numbers drawn out over a few minutes.
Yeah,
and it's like, did you optimize your character progression correctly to deal with these enemies or not? It's not it's not really are you good at making tactical decisions in the moment?
Very little.
With the game like XCOM, which is all about which is really centered on the tactical combat, and everything kind of feeds into that, and that's where the interesting decisions are designed to mostly come from, within relatively tight bounds, like sometimes surprisingly tight bounds, for the game to really function and not just to be a walkover. And RPGs kind of toy with that really big time, because suddenly the design has a lot of progression hooks in it, and making those make work in combat to make things interesting is really difficult, because often it just goes overboard into being way too hard or way too easy.
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's definitely something that's that's one of the reasons that I have found it really important to make more of a conscious distinction between strategy games and RPGs. Is this inherent rub of we have these RPGs, and I understand why. Like, there's a lot of games like Final Fantasy Tactics is a really good example of something that's a lot of people would just consider it a straight up RPG, but it actually has a lot of strategic depth and almost kind of would function as just a strategy game in some ways. And so there's a lot of blurring between them, and there's some interesting areas to explore in there too. But I also think that this one issue of like, you're just getting more resources over time, and it's like I'm entering into a chess match and now I have like 3 queens instead of 2, or instead of 1, right. That kind of thing, and that does start messing with strategy games. So after the pod system, what else did XCOM try? In XCOM 2 there was
so there's the meld system. Yeah, so the meld is giving you a reward for going out into the map more aggressively. And picking up these canisters, which let you then beef up your dudes. So that didn't really work because it feeds into a lot of the pre-existing spiraling power level problems that we just discussed. Now, that was their attempt. They didn't make any other attempts, as far as I know, in the expansions of dealing with this problem. Then XCOM 2 came out. They did some huge changes to the way the game worked, both in terms of how they set up missions, and also in terms of how you make that initial contact with the aliens. And manage the hidden info in the beginning of the mission. So XCOM 2 as a game has the conceit that you are the aliens have taken over the world, and you're kind of a guerrilla outfit that's fighting back against the aliens using little hit and run raids to like destroy various alien monuments and otherwise cause mayhem.
Mm-hmm.
So the setup allows the designers to play with the idea of like sneaking around as like a guerrilla force. And the way it achieves this is in the design, like mechanically, is the player can see in the beginning of the mission, the player is in concealment, it's called, which is like a special state where their units can see the normal distance, but aliens can only see a short distance around them. Which means that you see the aliens before they see you, like unless you do something like round a corner and there's an alien right there, which is not very common. And you can also largely, because of the way the maps are laid out, you can kind of avoid that in most cases.
Sure.
So it's usually not a problem. But so the player can see the aliens and not have to immediately fight them. And then the aliens just kind of keep patrolling, walking. Unfortunately, they walk around randomly, which kind of sucks. But like as a design thing, it's not great. Mm-hmm. We can get into that more later. But for now, it's important to note that this kind of guerrilla mode that you start in also plays with also there are time limits on the missions, which without the guerrilla mode would be really freaking difficult to design effectively. Mm-hmm. Like if you were playing XCOM 2012 with mission timers, you would just be blundering into aliens like left and right. It would be a kind of brutal experience, and a lot of people might not like it. It would be a significantly more difficult game.
Sure.
But in XCOM 2, since you can see the aliens before they see you, at least before you get in that first combat encounter. After the first combat encounter, things revert back to basically being XCOM 2012.
Okay.
In the sense of, like when you see a pod, they activate.
So now that's not per pod, that's per the entire mission?
Right.
Interesting.
Yes. And there are special abilities you can get. I think it's on the Ranger class specifically, where the entire squad gains and loses concealment together. Like they gain concealment at the beginning of the mission and they lose it once they start shooting at something or use an ability. But Rangers can gain an ability where they stay in concealment if they personally don't shoot. If the rest of the squad shoots and loses concealment, the Ranger can still maintain it as long as they don't engage in combat. Okay. So they do some stuff with that. So they make use of. It's kind of cool. Mm-hmm. So the way that concealment and really synergizes with the turn time limits really well, I think, because the concealment allows you to kind of scout things and get a good idea of how things are situated for a significant area of the map before you commit to like the kind of risky stuff you're going to have to do to get to the end of the mission before the time limit runs out. Right. And missions usually involve kind of crossing a lot of space because you have to get from where you were dropped off by the Sky Ranger, the entry point of the mission, you have to get to an evac point, which is almost always on the other side of the map, or at least in the middle of the map. And you might also have to get to other places on the map along the way too, like get to a prison and break out some resistance fighters, stuff like that.
And this is all with a timer, you said?
Yeah, this is all with a timer. And the timer, it seems like the timer is always like, since the missions are procedurally generated, the timer itself seems to be procedurally set to a time which allows you, which forces you to sprint on a couple of turns. So it prevents you from doing that kind of creeping forward thing where you just go forward one move action and then overwatch. Right. You can't do that because if you did that, you would lose all your guys due to the timer expiring.
Oh, so that's the penalty? If the timer expires, you literally lose all your guys?
Anybody who has not been evac'd is lost.
Wow.
Or captured by the aliens.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's intense.
Yeah, so basically it gives you like these gaping pits of terribleness on both sides of the going too fast, going too slow thing, which kind of keeps you in the middle zone of going just fast enough.
Right.
And that seemed, in my experience with XCOM 2, that basically solves the problem. Like you cannot, you still want to be somewhat conservative, but you still have to engage in combat and move forward. You can't just sit there and shoot. You have to be like, okay, I have to move forward towards the enemies because I have to get past them to get to the objective.
Right.
And that's a huge positive thing for the design of the game, I think.
Yeah, that is really cool. And what comes to mind for me is, I used to really hate sequels for some reason. And well, I mean, for I guess obvious reasons that most people don't like sequels or have some kind of resistance to sequels. But like today, these days, it seems like this team was working on XCOM. They're not the same team that was working on XCOM back in 1995. Or I don't think there's anyone that's involved. Maybe there might be, but I doubt it. And so they really sort of made like kind of a new game with XCOM 2012. Like it's quite distinctly different from the 1995 game. And it seems like, a lot of the design stuff in the original game to me struck me as very like kind of like the first thing you would maybe think to do kind of stuff. And it sounds like they're, over time they're iterating on it. And didn't you say there was an expansion for 2 that sort of made it even better?
Yeah, it's Enemy Within is the name of the not Enemy Within. Blah. That's the XCOM 2012 expansion. It's called War of the Chosen. The XCOM 2 expansion. And it adds some stuff. I don't have great positive feelings about it. It basically adds some variety.
Oh, I see.
It adds some new map generation stuff, I think, and it also adds these 3 different like boss-ish enemies that kind of taunt you and they show up in missions throughout the campaign, and like they have different areas of the overworld map that they inhabit, so like you can choose which ones to fight when. It's okay. It adds some variety to the thing, but it's not a major game design impacting thing.
It sounds like it's more of like a meta game sort of improvement thing, like where
to some extent. Well, it's actually you do fight these bossish guys in the tactical missions too. Right. Like they show up randomly. And then you just have to kind of like make them retreat or fight them until they run out of HP, and then they kind of like smoke bomb their way out of there, which is kind of disappointing. But I don't know. So Enemy Within isn't Enemy Within. I keep saying that. Sorry. War of the Chosen is not a big design leap forward as much as XCOM 2 is over XCOM 2012.
Gotcha. And now, so you feel like this problem has basically been solved. Of this whole creeping forward thing, and it more or less works in a pretty healthy way, the way you would want it to?
Yeah, I think so. But I think that there are still some flaws because after you break concealment in XCOM 2, you still run into that same problem of, you're just going to stumble into aliens.
Oh, right.
And like that's still kind of a problem, and I think there are ways you can address that.
Like what would you suggest going forward to make XCOM 3? Like what should they do?
Well, an interesting system which I'm kind of prototyping and experimenting with now. I'm going to start working on it soon. In a little prototype I've been making to try and play with XCOM ideas, XCOM-like ideas, is to have a variable level of knowledge about what's going on in the fog of war based on how close you are to an area, a certain area of the map. So, like you could say when you're far away from aliens, they could indicate in a big area like, oh, hey, there's a pod, and it's like in this 50-foot radius area. Oh, but as you get closer, they could make the radius smaller and smaller and smaller.
Sure.
So it basically is a variable fog of war thing, and that could significantly reduce the amount of the amount of like unnecessary surprise, and it could increase the planning, especially increase your ability to plan around where enemies are and stuff. You would of course not want to make this super accurate,
right?
Without getting very close, because then the player could just try and dodge all the aliens. That kind of sucks. You don't want them to be able to dodge all the aliens. You want them to have to fight some of them.
Yeah.
But you want it to be a more conscious decision about like, okay, when and where do I fight the aliens? And like, who can I bypass? Who can't I bypass? What space is available to me to fight in? I think that and once you give the player a good idea of what space they can fight in, I think that really opens up the combat system, because then you can like do a lot more flanking. You can use the positional abilities a lot more without feeling like you're going to just, blow up a wall and suddenly there's 15 aliens on your ass.
Yeah, I feel like some games have that. In fact, I think the original XCOM, I never used it, but I know it has, the original XCOM has a like some kind of scanning device that like is like a motion sensor thing. And I think it does something like that where it just sort of like tells you the direction that something's coming from. There are definitely games that do that. I'm almost surprised that they don't use like sound as like the theme, as like the way of expressing that. Like, so
they
you
actually
could just,
do. They do in XCOM 2012. If you don't run into any aliens for a while, they'll give you a little sound cue thing, which is like a visual indicator that just points in the direction aliens are. It's very vague though.
Well,
like,
that's
what I'm
something.
saying is,
Yeah.
it's something, but it's like you don't know how far away they are, so it's still not. It's still like, like I think that if you had a more dynamic system which did it based on distance, and it could also be you could also have like weather conditions in the mission or something like that modulate how much information you get, like how close you have to get to really be able to get better information and stuff like that. You could play with it and do interesting things, but I think that having it not just be a binary thing is very important, and having the resolution of the information you have get better the closer you get to the aliens, instead of it just being on or off, is a very important thing for letting the player plan without letting them plan too much.
Right. So if we were to boil this all into a kind of like lesson-ish thing about game design, strategy game design in general, I think there would be some themes about like maybe non-binary hidden information, like
right.
That would be one thing. But there's also a thing about like timers and how to like you phrased your article carrot or stick, and how to so that obviously you have this really huge, like the timer solution to me always in every game that there's a hard timer like that. It always feels like it'll work, but like players sort of have to kind of like learn the tempo of that timer, like how long it is, and they have to like work with it sort of. Otherwise it's just this, you're playing and then all of a sudden the timer's up, and it can be, I feel like people have complained about timers in sports where like if the timer's too long, you sort of don't feel it for the first, giant chunk of time. So timers are interesting. And how do you make someone progress through a level? And that's something that I struggled with a lot with Oro. Eventually we came to that system of the combo system where you just need to basically keep getting like kills quickly, and the mission just will become more and more hard as time goes on. So the longer you spend like wasting time, the lower your odds get over time. But yeah, it's an interesting question. How would you phrase like what is the takeaway for this?
Yeah, I think that what you have to recognize when you're designing a game, especially one that has very long arcs like XCOM does, is you gotta the rewards and the penalties on different scales, I guess. You have to think, because the penalties in a game like XCOM are really negative, really, really, really intense and bad, and you can incur these penalties for like really innocuous stuff, like just going a couple tiles too wide on a turn, or like breaking through a window and jumping down instead of going down a ladder. And then suddenly you've like revealed a pod and all your guys are out of position and you're screwed.
Yeah.
And then the result of that is like a guy dies forever.
Right.
And then all of the stuff that it's like you could have a dozen missions that you've invested in leveling up this guy and getting all these abilities, and then giving also great equipment that you've invested in them. You lose it all like just because you moved a little wrong.
Yeah.
It's like there's stuff you can do about it, but there's not a whole lot of stuff. So the penalties are super, super steep, while at the same time the rewards are incremental and slow. You get some XP and you get a promotion every couple of missions. It's not like the penalty where it's like, oh, you could do the wrong thing and you're toast. It's like you do the right thing and you get a small pat on the back. So
sure,
trying to balance those really big penalties with rewards is just, it's feeding into the wrong part of the system almost.
That's
so I'd say like you want to try and if you're going to have a strong penalty that forces conservative play, you need to also have a strong penalty that forces aggressive play, or else people are just going to play conservatively. You can't do it with just rewards.
Sure. That makes sense. Yeah. Another possible solution would be to, tone down those super intense penalties and
Right.
make it like, maybe your guys, maybe there isn't permadeath for your characters and maybe they get injured and they're out for the mission, or maybe they're out for one mission after. Depends on how long they get injured, which actually is already a system, at least in the old XCOM. I forget if it's in 2012. Injuries, is that a thing?
Injuries are a thing, yes, but that's also a penalty. That's a penalty, though.
It is, but it's not
just
quite as harsh. I'm just suggesting
here's
ways that it could be slightly less harsh. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's an alternate way of thinking about it, which I've been kind of toying with in my own design thinking around this kind of a game. Is that okay? What if you can only gain XP when you're not on missions, and you have to go on missions in order to progress the game in other ways? So. And when you go on missions, it basically tires you out, and you don't get that important training that you'd get if you were not on the mission. So like each individual character then has to get rotated through missions, and you can't bring them on missions too often. And it kind of breaks that loop of characters who go on missions are better than characters who don't. So like you just bring the same people on missions all the time.
Sure.
And then you can also get rid of permadeath, because then you're naturally, because I think that the idea of permadeath, like where it really shines in a system like this, is that it forces squad rotation, and it forces you to bring a lot of different resources into battles and figure out how to solve problems in different ways. But like, why doesn't the game could take a much more aggressive stance on this and be like, hey, look, you're rotating guys out. Like the game has very predictable things. The game should have very predictable things that say like, hey, look, you bring somebody on a mission, you're rotating them out next mission. So like you got to keep mixing and matching your resources.
There's an XCOM labor union that labor regulations.
Well, that's a silly way of thinking about it, but you could also think about it in terms of like combat stress. Like
for sure.
Like seeing aliens makes you insane, and you could just have a sanity thing, even a basic sanity thing, where like you go on a mission and you just take sanity damage, and that replenishes slowly, like over the course of a certain amount of like days. And like, so if you do 2 missions a week, you can't bring a guy on 2 missions in 1 week. You have to bring him on like 1 mission every 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. And then suddenly, like all the stuff that makes permadeath so important to the system kind of doesn't need permadeath anymore. You can do that. You can do that by manipulating the other incentives in the system.
Yeah, it's funny. I played D&D recently, and it's like a very casual group, and this is sort of a tangent, but it's a very casual group, and it's just like, it struck me that like, wait, this game has permadeath? Like, if my character like runs out of health and a few other conditions are met, like I have to just delete my character because of rules. Like, I don't know. It just struck me that like there, as much as particularly when in the roguelike sort of mini micro revolution, that people got really excited about permadeath because they are real consequences, which obviously we want that in strategy games. But I also think that there's a way that we sort of maybe just accept the mechanic of permadeath because there's a coolness to it. It sort of feels like Iron Man, and it's undeniably a consequence, and I think we're very thirsty for consequences in games, and so maybe that's what has happened there. And that puts us into that situation where it's like, okay, if you have permadeath in your game, it's cool and edgy, but at the same time it really flattens out what you can do with rewards to balance things out. It makes a lot of things a lot more difficult. It makes a lot of incentives a lot more difficult to balance because you have such a stark penalty that you can never make up for with any reward, really. Yeah, that's true. All right. So anything else you want to say on the topic before we move on?
No, I think that was a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Me too. We'll definitely have you back on again soon. All right, so that was my conversation with Evizaer. I again recommend that if you enjoyed that conversation, or if you are just generally interested in game design, check out his blog, nohidden.info. As always, I'm trying to encourage more people to do writing on game design. I think that we had a big, sort of boom of that in the sort of mid 2000s to, to about 2010 or 2011, 2013. Not exactly sure what caused it to really stop, but they really kind of died off. I think there's a few elements of that could help to explain that, some of which we've talked about in my conversation with Will Parton on a few episodes back. But yeah, I really encourage people, just, if you have some ideas, if you have an idea for a term, a different way of looking at a problem, just write a blog post. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It could be like, 4 paragraphs long or something. I really encourage that. Send it to me. I'll check it out. I love to try to support people, get the word out. And you can also post it on my Discord, and people love talking about game design stuff on the Discord. So please come by and do that. So thanks again to Evizaer for that conversation, which I did think went really well. So the last thing I want to do before we wrap up today's show is talk about paper prototypes. And this is going to be kind of quick, but I just want to talk about my experience doing paper prototypes, because, the common wisdom is with video games that, or with game design generally, is that you should quickly prototype, your idea in a very, very simple. And I do this because it's kind of pretty well accepted that you should. And I understand the idea behind it. But my experience, particularly designing for video games, is that it's not useful. I've never had it help me, really. Or if I have, it's been very in a very small way. I've never found. So in order to make a paper prototype of a video game, first of all, it's tricky to figure out how to abstractify your video game. Obviously, this can only really be done for turn-based games. You can't even begin to really do that so much with real-time games. I mean, you kind of can if you have some subsystems that you can abstract into, and into paper components. But it gets really abstract and weird. And I find that, and this is kind of an anti-formalist-ish sounding argument, but I find that stuff doesn't, the abstracted version of stuff is it's really not the same as the non-abstracted version. So, the far extreme version of what I'm saying here is that it's all aesthetic, and that it's all about the sound that plays when you click the button, and it has the rules don't matter at all. It's all about these sounds and visuals are giving you this pleasure because of how they look and sound. And I think a lot of people sort of believe that, and it sort of shows in a lot of, especially console games, which are entirely about their visuals and their audio visual immersion and stuff like that. And their rule sets are just nothing. I'm certainly not saying that, but I do think that, one of the big ways that a system communicates itself to the player at all, and that the player can kind of connect with the system, is through stuff like audiovisual feedback, stuff like seeing an animation happen. So for example, if you have an ability and it, has I don't know, it's let's say it's a real-time game and it has a 2-second cooldown, and you have an animation, or if you don't have an animation, the difference there is bigger than it would seem to a purely formal designer, right? A totally formal game design perspective would say it doesn't matter what's really being shown on the screen. All that matters is what actually the game state is. And I find that that's just not true. And it's not so much because it's not fun without the animations. It's more that the game doesn't communicate itself properly without some animations, some feedback, some sound, some things like that. There's just not a communication happening, and there's a disconnect. I find this happens a lot in early, even in early builds, early alpha builds of someone's indie game that they're working on. And it's, even if I understand the rules, I can't really enjoy it and internalize it and play it properly without some of that audio visual feedback. If I really stuck with it, and stuck with it for long enough, maybe I would sort of get over that and sort of learn its language and be able to really engage with it. I mean, I've certainly been able to play, things that have nothing like audio visual feedback, although most of these are, super abstract kinds of games, Puerto Rico and, Race for the Galaxy kind of things. Yeah, so when it comes to more I'm thinking about roguelike-y indie games, I find that it's hard to apply emotional energy. And I think we have to admit that, like, if you're going to play something, there's an emotional, like, human component there of like you're choosing to spend your time with this thing over doing 1,000 other things that you could be doing. And so it's not so much that you need to like win them over with some great drawing or something like that. It's more that you have to speak to them and communicate, make sure that your game is communicating with them and engaging with them as they are with it. I think a lot of times these like very simple early versions of things are entirely one-way conversations where the like we're talking to the game, but it's sort of not talking back to us at all. And so anyway, getting back to paper prototypes, I find that has that problem, but even worse. I remember making paper prototypes. I've done it for every game I've ever made. I remember paper prototypes, several of them for Oro. There was a big phase of paper prototyping. Probably my peak of paper prototyping was for Empire, the deck building strategy game, which, was it helpful? I don't know. I mean, I kind of don't think it was terribly helpful, because that thing that I made on the board, on the table with paper and cards, was actually rather abstracted still from, and necessarily so, from the rule set. So number one, you can't ever really copy the rule set 1-to-1. You kind of have to like, cheat stuff out. Also, it's so cumbersome that you're not going to play your paper prototype a lot. You're just not gonna. I mean, feel free to disagree with me on this, but like in my experience, like, I'll spend like an hour building the prototype, and then I'll spend, I don't know, another hour or two playing it, and messing with it and like modifying it and kind of extracting some lessons with it. Actually, I find the most useful is even just in the process of building the paper prototype and then just looking at it. When I first like look at it, I see it on the table, and I see my game idea sort of realized in a physical form. That's actually more informative to me a lot of the time than playing it, because it's very difficult to play. It's very difficult to like, really sort of dive into. I might even say it's almost impossible to play because you're trying to keep your original rule set in mind and the rule set of what's right in front of you on the table, and you're trying to play as a player, even though everything's imbalanced, and like, you also want to fight that. It's the reason we need play testers, right? Like, because game designers sort of can't play their own games to some extent because they're always thinking like, oh, but this could change. This should be like this, thinking about the next patch change. And so I find paper prototyping really difficult, very low utility, particularly for video games, and impossible for real-time games. And so I just thought, I don't know, I've never heard anybody really talk about paper prototypes this way. I tend to hear people just like singing their praises. And now one thing I will say in defense of maybe not paper prototypes, but one thing that's sort of related that I do like is really quickly, iteratively making throwaway board games. I used to, for years, actually, I think there was 1 year where every night I would write out a board game rule set, tabletop rule set. And I actually never play tested most of those, but I would just make one, just design one and just throw it in the garbage. And I think that is really worth doing for designers. I think also just making, so here's another point, with tabletop games that I'm actually making and I'm actually working on, I often find so I'll start making a paper prototype for my card game, and I actually find I should just make the first version of the game. Like, it's more work to just so I'm going to add the necessary text and make it playable. Why not? It's going to take me a little longer, and it's a little bit wasteful, but then people can actually start playing the game. And to me, that's important. That's what's important. That's my kind of big takeaway lesson here, is that the paper prototyping, play testing, quote unquote, with this thing that's 1/5 of the game, it's not that valuable. I really recommend instead get as fast as possible to something that's playable, whether that's an early version of your game, or, don't think about prototypes as much. I mean, I guess it's sort of a blurry line, like what's a prototype and what is just an early version, an unfinished version of the game. But I recommend thinking more about along the lines of like, I'm just making the game. And this is just like as far as I can get with it right now. And here it is, let's play it and make it as playable as possible. Sometimes that means even like, making art, making animations, adding sounds, like doing whatever it takes to make this thing more playable. Because remember that you're making something that's like really going to have an engagement with a human being. And I think that's especially for people who probably like this podcast. We need to remember. So yeah, let me know what you think about what are your experiences with paper prototyping. Let me know. And I'd love to hear from you about that. As always, if you enjoyed this show, please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com/KeithBurgun. I could really use the help, and things have been going better and better, and it really is. This episode and I think the last episode, I'm going to put them both up on YouTube with some very, very simple graphics. I just want to keep expanding what we're doing here, and you're helping make that happen, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much to all my current patrons. Your help really supports me and lets me do this. So thank you so much, and send me your game design blog. I will see you next time.